I want to thank Maureen for her storytelling. It's a great story that we usually hear at a different time of year, but I think it fits today as well. So thank you very much. You may have heard of Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie and her TED Talk entitled "The Danger of a Single Story." Adichie is a Nigerian writer, and her TED Talk warns of the risk of allowing ourselves to rely on only one perspective or one story to inform our understanding of people, without considering a balance of multiple stories which would provide a more complex and nuanced view of another person or of a group of people. Adichie describes how she herself has been guilty of buying into a single story about other people, and how she has also been on the receiving end as a Nigerian in the United States of this kind of thinking. As a young writer living in the United States, she once had a professor tell her that her writing was not authentically African. Writing from a middle-class Nigerian perspective, her characters drove cars and were well educated. But because they were not poor and starving, the professor, operating under the influence of a single story, found them to be inauthentic. Assuming we know everything about someone based on just one perspective leads to misunderstandings and stereotypical, prejudicial thinking, ultimately resulting in an incomplete understanding of who they are. Relying on a single story blinds us to alternative perspectives and prevents us from developing authentic relationships with people we meet every day. So I was reminded of Adichie and her TED Talk as I began working on this sermon, because the big mystery in the story of the road to Emmaus is that the two disciples were kept from recognizing Jesus. And we wonder, how is that possible? They've been following him and hanging out with him for the past 3 years. So we wonder, well, does a resurrected Jesus look different? That seems plausible, although they have been walking along the road and listening to him teach and talk about the scriptures. You'd think during that walk they'd have been able to figure out who he was. But think about these two disciples on the road. So many scholars suggest that the unnamed disciple may have been the wife of Cleopas. So the picture on the front of your bulletin has a man and a woman. Lots of scholars think that that is possible. Often women in the stories do remain unnamed, so that's possible. But the fact that Luke doesn't name this disciple also affords us the opportunity to place ourselves in the story. So imagine you're the other disciple walking with Cleopas. You've likely fled Jerusalem that day in uncertainty or fear. You heard from the women at the tomb that morning that an angel told them Jesus is alive. They don't believe it. You don't believe it. You're completely overcome with grief and disappointment. You're overcome with this loss of Jesus, but also the loss of a dream of what could have been, with what this new kingdom that you expected Jesus to usher in would have meant to your people. The text says the disciples had hoped that Jesus would redeem Israel. Now you are without hope. But even more than that, your grief causes you to lose the ability to imagine a different reality, one where Jesus could actually be walking down the road with you. It's easy to understand why, given the events of the last few days. But Cleopas seems to have accepted what appears to be his new reality, that Jesus is dead, his body was probably stolen, and his mission on earth is over. If these two disciples couldn't imagine a different story, how would they have been able to recognize Jesus standing in front of them? They likely believed in resurrection on the last day, but their minds would not have been able to comprehend resurrection today. Michael Beth Dinkler, a professor at Yale Divinity School, asked these questions. What if the disciples cannot recognize Jesus because their opinions are fully formed? What if the disciples can't see Jesus because they already think they understand everything that's going on? And she specifically forms this idea based on verse 18, where Cleopas says, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who's unaware of what's happened recently?" Cleopas knows what happened with certainty. Cleopas has accepted a single story and expects that everyone around him knows and accepts that same story. So what single stories do you believe? Because we all do this, sometimes unwittingly, sometimes because it's easier, but you can't miss it once you start thinking about it. We are quickly becoming a country of single stories, although really, we always kind of have been. For instance, we know now that it's completely inappropriate to tell the story of so-called savage Indians without also telling the story of European colonists encroaching on indigenous lands and peoples. We weren't always so completely aware of that. People all over the country are at odds right now because of the single stories we accept. People say all Democrats are socialists, all Republicans are racist. Some of them are hard to say, right? I mean, a lot of them are uncomfortable, but you can fill in the blanks, I'm sure, because single stories abound in our culture about immigrants, Muslims, unemployed workers, Southerners, Northerners, people without homes, the vaccinated or unvaccinated, pro-mask, anti-mask, and that barely scratches the surface. Our differences confound us, and we've figured out it's easier to accept a single story than to seek out the multiple stories or to have those hard conversations that are required to uncover more than one story. But there's always more than one story to be discovered if we're curious enough and if we care to do so. If you have a certain opinion of folks who don't get vaccinated, you have to reevaluate when it's your niece or your sister. You have more stories about those people, right? Though you can't just focus on the single story. Ignoring multiple stories and making assumptions prevents us from developing a balanced view. It shuts down conversation because we think we already know all there is to know. Worse, the single story robs people of their dignity and it denies their humanity. Adichie's college roommate in a U.S. university was amazed to find out that her Nigerian roommate spoke excellent English, because it's the official language of Nigeria, that she knew how to use a stove, or when she asked to hear her tribal music, she gave her a recording of Mariah Carey. The roommate had accepted a narrative that Africans were primitive, poor, and to be pitied. And after Adichie spent several years in the U.S., she understood where that narrative came from because it's pervasive in popular culture and in Western literature. So what do? If we take our cues from today's Bible story of the road to Emmaus, we listen, we extend hospitality to strangers, we come to the table, we practice our faith, we come back to the table week after week, we gather multiple stories and keep proclaiming God's unconditional love for all. Even at this table, we usually just tell one story. Somewhere over the centuries, communion was transformed from this joyful feast shared in community to a solemn meditation on crucifixion and suffering. So some of you might remember several years ago, we hosted Disciples pastor and author Rita Nakashima Brock here for kind of a Saturday workshop. Brock wrote the book Saving Paradise, which tells the story of how she and her co-author discovered claims that artistic depictions of the crucifixion did not appear in early Christian churches until the 10th century. That's a long time. Assuming that this must be incorrect, given its emphasis in modern Christianity, they traveled the Mediterranean in search of depictions of the crucifixion in early Christian artwork. They found images in ancient churches of many Bible stories, depictions of the life of Jesus that included the Passion story, but not the crucifixion, many depictions of the risen Jesus, and many images of paradise. It's a really thick book. But in short, they concluded, for one thing, that for the early Christians, the death of Jesus was not a key to meaning, not an image of devotion, not a ritual symbol of faith. Instead, their depictions were of Christ as healer, teacher, shepherd, risen Lord. And we know from readings in the book of Acts that the early Christians gathered on the first day of the week to feast and to celebrate the risen Christ. Many of you know Mike Graves, and he has a book called Table Talk. And he explains that banquets in ancient times, even before Christianity, began with the breaking of bread. It was a known ritual of welcome and sharing, which took on a religious meaning in the early church. The drinking of the cup after supper was an ancient ritual as well that became tied to Paul and Luke's description of Jesus at the Last Supper. Likewise, after supper, he took the cup, and after giving thanks. So that's what we often hear at our own communion table now. So these practices in the early church varied widely in different communities, but the rituals of the bread and the cup eventually became separated out from that main meal, rather than just being at the beginning and the end. So they became kind of their own ritual, what we refer to today as the communion or Eucharist. And over time, the church turned that ritual into a more solemn occasion, with more of a focus on betrayal and sacrifice, and eventually an emphasis on correct belief and correct practice, rather than on a joyous celebration of community and connection and resurrection. But we need both stories. Remembrance and celebration are both key to our understanding of this table. Even those early Christians observed a more solemn table ritual during Lent as they were preparing for Easter. But an overemphasis on betrayal and death results in a loss of the festive joy that was exhibited by those early Christians. Jesus basically eats his way through Galilee, especially in the Gospel of Luke. There's no shortage of stories to tell at this table. One author says Jesus is either going to a meal, at a meal, or coming from a meal. Today's story, where the disciples recognize and experience Jesus' presence in the breaking of the bread, is just one example. There's the feeding of the 5,000. There's having lunch with Zacchaeus. There's the parable of the great banquet. Those are just like the first three that come to mind. So today, Ginny is going to do our words of institution, and they're based off this Road to Emmaus story as just one example of how we can tell different stories at this table. World Communion Sunday, as we heard in the children's moment, is a day when Christians all over the world gather to partake of this feast, to celebrate our unity in Christ. But days like this run the risk of being mostly performative if we don't allow them to change our perspective. That's not exactly why the chairs got changed today, but it fits. You're all kind of sitting in, well, unless you're in an alcove, you are sitting in a little bit different seat with a different perspective. Each week when we come to this table, we are invited to walk with Jesus and imagine a different world. We're invited to pay attention to the stories we have relied on and who is telling them, not just at this table, but in our workplaces, our social media spaces, our schools, our coffee shops, our homes. We're invited to challenge ourselves, to embrace the entirety of who our neighbors really are and make space for them in our lives and at our tables. Accepting one story as the only story not only limits our relationships, but like the disciples on the road, it may cause us to miss Jesus altogether. As this bread is broken and this wine is poured, may our eyes be opened to the face of Jesus in our neighbors down the street and around the world. Amen.